This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and much more dangerous. It's about what happens when a powerful institution returns to the exact place where it has already failed. Not to explain, not to repair, but to reassert itself. Nothing here is accidental. Not the timing, not the location, not the response. When authority comes back after harm, it tells you something. It tells you the system believes memory fades faster than power does. You may think this story is about a single city or a single moment or a single agency. It isn't. This is about how force tests the limits of public resistance, how it watches, measures, and adjusts. If you're still with me, stay. Because what happened next reveals how this system actually works. And once you see it, you can't unsee where this is going. You're told this system is controlled by laws, by elections, by courts, by oversight. That's the comforting version. What actually controls it is repetition, routine, normalization. Power doesn't need to convince you it's right. It only needs to show up often enough that resistance feels abnormal. What you're watching is not enforcement, it's calibration. An institution tests how much presence it can exert, how much fear it can generate, how much disruption a community will absorb before it pushes back. And when it does push back, that response becomes data. This is no longer about individuals making decisions. It's about a system that has learned something dangerous. That backlash can be managed, outweighted, reframed. The public is taught to look for villains, but systems don't need villains to function. They need procedures. And once procedures replace accountability, force no longer feels like a choice. It feels like policy. That's the frame. And it's already shifting again because the most destabilizing changes never announce themselves. There was a time when this kind of presence would have stopped everything. It would have triggered hearings, investigations, pauses. Before, force arrived as an exception. Now, it arrives as a schedule. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, through repetition. What once felt unthinkable became familiar. What once caused outrage became background noise. And what became background noise stopped activating alarms. This is how systems change without ever admitting they've changed. You're not asked to agree. You're asked to adapt. Communities adjust their routines. Parents adjust their expectations. Children adjust their sense of safety. And the system watches all of it. Because slow change is not meant to shock you. It's meant to exhaust you. The most dangerous power doesn't announce itself with force. It introduces itself through normalization. And once normalization sets in, escalation doesn't look like escalation anymore. It looks like continuity. That's where this moves next. Then the system miscalculates. It returns to the same place, the same neighborhood, where harm has already occurred, not quietly, not cautiously. Force appears again, publicly, visibly. And this time, people are watching. You see agents deploy tear gas into a residential space. Not targeted, not restrained, just released. The official explanation doesn't matter because the effect is the point. Gas spreads, fear spreads faster. Neighbors don't run. They gather, not with weapons, with bodies. They protect doors. They protect sidewalks. They protect each other. This is treated as disorder, but it isn't. It's a community responding to a system that has already shown it will not self-correct. If you're wondering why this moment matters, stay with me, because this wasn't a breakdown. It was a signal, and the system was watching very carefully to see what happened next. Here's the part that rarely gets explained. This system does not operate on outrage. It operates on insulation. The people deploying force do not absorb the consequences. They rotate out, they transfer, they advance. The cost moves in the opposite direction. It settles on neighborhoods, on families, on routines that are quietly disrupted and never fully restored. This is how the mechanism works. Authority applies pressure, community absorbs damage. Then the system measures whether normal life resumes anyway. If it does, the tactic is validated. No apology is required. No correction is necessary. Because the metric isn't justice. It's compliance over time. Even resistance gets folded into the process. Peaceful pushback becomes proof that the system is working, that it can withstand dissent, and the more resilient a community appears, the more pressure it is expected to endure. That's the hidden exchange. Stability in public, stress in private, which means what you saw wasn't a mistake. It was a test, and the results don't stay local. The pace changes now. More vehicles, more presence, less explanation, language hardens. Labels appear. What was grief becomes suspicion. What was proximity becomes pursuit. The system accelerates when it senses resistance organizing itself. Not because it's afraid, because it wants to stay ahead of coordination. Gas again, barricades, movement after dark. Nothing dramatic on its own. That's the point. Each action is small enough to defend. Together, they change the atmosphere. Parents calculate risk before school. Workers adjust routes. Silence becomes strategic. This isn't chaos. It's pressure applied just below the threshold that triggers intervention. And that threshold keeps moving. Because every time nothing stops it, the system learns it can go a little further next time. This is where people start asking the wrong question. They ask, how bad does it have to get? That's already the trap, because the system isn't waiting to go too far. It's waiting to see how much you'll accept. This is where it stops being abstract. Because this system doesn't experience fear. You do. You feel it when routines break, when your kids ask questions you weren't prepared to answer, when normal suddenly requires calculation. You start scanning sidewalks, listening for engines, deciding what not to say out loud. That's not hysteria. That's adaptation. And it's happening to people who never thought this was about them. Veterans, parents, faith leaders, workers who believed the rules were stable. You're not watching history repeat. You're watching expectations collapse in real time. And the most destabilizing part is this. The system doesn't need you to agree with it. It only needs you to keep living around it. If this feels personal, that's because it is. Because systems like this don't announce when you've crossed from observer to participant. If you're still here, don't look away now. What happens next is bigger than any one city. And once it spreads, it doesn't ask permission. This doesn't stay contained. Because systems like this don't operate in isolation. They watch each other. They borrow tactics. They normalize outcomes. What works in one place becomes a template somewhere else. Language travels first, then posture, then presence. Communities thousands of miles apart begin recognizing the same pattern, the same vehicles, the same explanations, the same insistence that nothing unusual is happening. That's how local force becomes systemic practice. Internationally, this is familiar. States testing pressure, measuring response, adjusting intensity. What's different now is where it's happening. Not at borders, not overseas, inside daily civilian life. And once that line blurs, it's very hard to redraw because every system tells itself the same thing. This is temporary. This is contained. This is necessary. History suggests otherwise. What begins as situational becomes structural. What is justified by urgency becomes embedded through routine. And the question shifts, not whether this will spread, but how fast, which brings us to what comes next. From here, there are three paths. None of them are neutral. The first is adjustment. The system pulls back slightly, not because it admits error, but because pressure becomes inefficient. Presence softens, language moderates, the structure remains intact, just quieter. Waiting. The second path is erosion. Nothing dramatic happens. Force stays. Rules blur. Oversight thins. People adapt again. Lower expectations replace outrage. The extraordinary becomes ordinary without ever being declared permanent. And then there is rupture. That's when the feedback loop breaks. When presence no longer deters, but provokes. When communities stop absorbing pressure and start reflecting it back, not in coordination, not in ideology, but in volume. Rupture is not revolution. It's miscalculation meeting exhaustion. The system believes it still controls the tempo. The public realizes the cost has already been paid. Which path emerges doesn't depend on intent. It depends on thresholds. And thresholds, once crossed, are very hard to walk back. That's why what happens next matters more than what already happened. There's a reason systems like this never announce an ending, because endings create accountability. And accountability requires memory. So instead, you get continuity, one deployment blending into the next, one justification replacing the last. You're told this is about order, about safety, about necessity, but systems don't drift toward restraint on their own. They drift toward whatever they're allowed to become. And right now, what's dangerous isn't what you can see. It's what's being practiced, refined, normalized. The most consequential moments don't arrive with alarms. They arrive disguised as routine. If you're looking for reassurance, this isn't it. Because the question isn't whether this stops. It's whether it finishes becoming permanent before enough people recognize the pattern. This story doesn't end here. It widens. If you want to understand what comes next, stay with me. Because the next phase isn't louder. It's quieter, more procedural, and much harder to reverse. And once it locks in, history doesn't announce that either.